The moment Gideon Kane saw the young woman being turned away from the white clapboard church on Roswell's main street, something twisted hard in his chest, and he knew his peaceful Sunday morning had just become considerably more complicated. He had come down from his mountain cabin, 15 miles north of Roswell, New Mexico, for supplies, not expecting to witness anything more dramatic than the usual Sunday gathering of townsfolk in their finest clothes. But there she stood on the church steps, a slender woman in a faded blue dress that had seen better days, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, while Reverend Holbrook blocked the entrance with his considerable bulk and an expression of righteous indignation that made Gideon's jaw clench. "I have told you before, Miss Wright, that your presence is not welcome in this house of God," the Reverend was saying, his voice carrying across the dusty street where Gideon had just tied his horse to the hitching post. "A woman of your profession has no place among decent, God-fearing people." The woman's back straightened, and even from this distance Gideon could see her hands trembling at her sides. "I only want to pray, Reverend Holbrook. The same as anyone else." "The same as anyone else?" The Reverend's face reddened. "You work at that saloon, serving liquor to men, consorting with who knows what manner of sin. You are a corrupting influence, and I will not have you contaminating my congregation." Several well-dressed women had gathered behind the Reverend, their faces twisted with disdain. One of them, Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, spoke up. "The Reverend is right. We cannot have our children exposed to such immorality. You should be ashamed of yourself, Marigold Wright." Gideon crossed the street in 4 long strides, his boots kicking up dust. He was a tall man, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms thick with muscle from years of chopping wood, hauling stone, and surviving in the harsh mountain wilderness. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his isolated lifestyle. He had not planned on getting involved in town politics, but something about the scene before him struck a nerve he had not known was still sensitive. "Reverend," he said, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs of the gathering crowd, "I reckon the good book says something about casting the first stone, or maybe about welcoming the stranger and the outcast." Reverend Holbrook turned, his expression shifting from righteous anger to forced civility when he recognized Gideon. The mountain man was known in these parts, respected for his skill and self-sufficiency, but also somewhat feared for his size and the quiet intensity he carried. "Mr. Kane, this is a church matter. It does not concern you." "It concerns me when I see a woman being denied the right to worship," Gideon said evenly, his gray eyes, sharp as flint, fixed on the Reverend. "Seems to me that goes against everything your book teaches." "This woman works in a saloon," Mrs. Patterson interjected, her voice shrill. "She serves drinks to men. Who knows what else she does there? We cannot allow such a person among us." Gideon turned his gaze to the woman in question. She had lifted her head now, and he found himself looking into a pair of the most striking brown eyes he had ever seen. They were deep and warm, like honey in sunlight, but shadowed with hurt and something else he recognized all too well: loneliness. Her face was beautiful in a quiet, unassuming way, with delicate features that spoke of both strength and vulnerability. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, he guessed, and there was an innocence about her that made the accusations being hurled at her seem all the more cruel. "Working in a saloon is honest work," Gideon said, his voice hardening. "More honest than some things I have seen so-called respectable people do in this town." The crowd murmured, and several people shifted uncomfortably. Gideon had a reputation for speaking his mind, and his isolation on the mountain gave him a certain immunity from the social pressures that kept most people in line. "Mr. Kane, I must ask you to step aside," the Reverend said, his tone growing firmer. "Miss Wright is not welcome here. That is my final word on the matter." Gideon looked at the woman again, saw the way her eyes had begun to glisten with unshed tears, saw the proud set of her shoulders even as shame tried to bow her down. Something shifted inside him, a decision crystallizing with a clarity that surprised him. "Then I reckon I am not welcome here either," he said. He stepped forward and offered his arm to the woman. "Miss Wright, would you allow me to escort you away from this place?" She stared at him for a long moment, surprise and confusion warring in her expression. Then, slowly, she placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was light, hesitant, and he could feel her trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. He led her away from the church, conscious of the whispers and stares following them down the street. His horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Buck, stood patiently at the hitching post. Gideon helped the woman onto a bench outside the general store, which was closed for the Sunday morning service. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentler now that they were away from the crowd. She nodded, but a tear escaped and traced down her cheek. She brushed it away quickly, as if ashamed. "I should not have tried. I knew they would turn me away. They always do. Always." Gideon settled onto the bench beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Every Sunday for the past 3 months," she said quietly. "I moved to Roswell in May. It is October now. Every Sunday I try to attend church, and every Sunday Reverend Holbrook turns me away. The other women in town will not speak to me. The men only speak to me when they come into the saloon." She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes. "But I am not what they think I am. I serve drinks, nothing more. Mr. Jameson, who owns the saloon, is a decent man. He does not run that kind of establishment. But no one believes me." Gideon studied her face, noting the honesty in her eyes, the dignity in her bearing despite her circumstances. "I believe you." She blinked, surprise widening her eyes. "You do?" "I do." He leaned back against the storefront. "I am Gideon Kane. I live up in the mountains, about 15 miles north of here." "I know who you are," she said. "People talk about you. They say you can track anything, that you survived a grizzly attack with nothing but a knife, that you choose to live alone because you prefer the company of animals to people." A wry smile tugged at his mouth. "Some of that is true. Some of it is exaggeration. But I do prefer solitude mostly." "Then why did you help me?" The question was soft, genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Gideon was quiet for a moment, considering. "Because what they did was wrong. Because I know what it feels like to be judged unfairly. And because no one should be turned away from God, no matter what anyone thinks of them." Marigold Wright looked at him with an expression that made his chest tighten. It was gratitude mixed with something deeper, something like recognition, as if she saw in him a kindred spirit. "I moved here from St. Louis," she said after a moment. "My parents died of cholera 2 years ago. I had no family, no money. A friend of my mother's had moved out here, and she wrote to tell me I could stay with her. But when I arrived, I found she had died the winter before. No one had thought to tell me. I had no money to go back east and no reason to go back anyway. Mr. Jameson offered me work at the saloon. It was the only work available for a woman alone with no family, no connections. I know people judge me for it, but I would rather work honestly than starve or do something truly shameful." "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Gideon said firmly. "Anyone who says otherwise is a hypocrite and a fool." She smiled then, a small, tentative smile that lit up her face. "You're very kind, Mr. Kane." "Gideon," he corrected, "just Gideon." "Then you must call me Marigold." She glanced back toward the church, where people were beginning to file inside for the service. "I should go. Thank you for your kindness, Gideon. It has been a long time since anyone defended me." He stood when she did, towering over her. She barely reached his shoulder, and he found himself thinking how fragile she looked, how in need of protection. "Where are you staying?" "I have a room above the saloon," she said. "It is small, but it is mine." Gideon nodded slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. It was impulsive, perhaps even foolish, but he had learned over his years in the mountains to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that Marigold Wright was someone worth knowing, someone worth protecting. "I come into town for supplies about once a month," he said. "If you ever need anything, you can leave word at the general store. Samuel Parker, the owner, is a friend of mine." "Thank you," she said again, "but I cannot imagine what I would need from a mountain man." "You never know," he said with a slight smile. "Mountains are full of surprises." She laughed softly at that, the sound like music, and then she walked away, her worn skirt swirling around her ankles. Gideon watched her go, his mind churning with thoughts he had not entertained in years. He had chosen his solitary life deliberately after coming west 5 years ago, after the war had ended, and he had found himself unable to settle back into civilization. The mountains had been his refuge, his healing place. But watching Marigold Wright walk down that dusty street, her head held high despite the shame heaped upon her, He felt something stir inside him that he had thought long dead. Over the next few weeks, Gideon could not get Marigold out of his mind. He tried to focus on his work, on preparing his cabin for the coming winter, on hunting and trapping, and the 100 other tasks that filled his days. But her face kept appearing in his thoughts, those warm brown eyes filled with hurt and hope in equal measure. He thought about the injustice of her being turned away from church, about the cruelty of so-called decent people, about the loneliness he had seen in her. He knew loneliness. He had lived with it for 5 years now, and he had convinced himself it was what he wanted, what he needed. But seeing Marigold had awakened something in him, a longing for connection, for purpose, beyond mere survival. The idea came to him on a cold October evening as he sat by his fire, watching the flames dance. If the church in town would not welcome her, then he would build her a church of her own, a chapel, small and simple, where she could worship in peace, where she would be welcome, where she would be valued. It was an audacious idea, perhaps even absurd. He had no training in church building, no congregation to fill it, but he had strong hands, a sharp mind, and the determination to see it through. And he had something else, a growing desire to see Marigold Wright smile again, to give her something beautiful in a world that had shown her mostly cruelty. The next morning, he began to plan. He would need wood, good pine from higher up the mountain. He would need stone for a foundation and a chimney. He would need glass for windows, which he would have to purchase in town. He would need tools, time, and an enormous amount of hard work. But he had all winter, and winter work had a way of keeping a man focused and purposeful. He spent the next week selecting trees, marking the ones he would cut. He chose a site for the chapel on his property, a level clearing with a view of the valley below and the distant mountains beyond. It was beautiful there, peaceful, the kind of place that made a man feel closer to God without any need for walls or pews. But walls and pews were what Marigold needed, so walls and pews she would have. By early November, he had cut enough timber to begin construction. He worked from dawn until dusk, felling trees, stripping bark, hewing logs. His muscles burned with the effort, but it was a good burn, the kind that reminded him he was alive and capable. As he worked, he thought about Marigold, wondering how she was doing in town, whether the townspeople were still treating her with contempt, whether she was warm enough in her room above the saloon. When he next went to town for supplies, he made a point of walking past the saloon. It was early afternoon before the evening crowd arrived, and through the window he could see Marigold wiping down tables, her movements efficient and graceful. She looked tired, he thought, with shadows under her eyes that had not been there before. On impulse, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The saloon was nearly empty, just a couple of old-timers playing cards in the corner and the bartender polishing glasses. Marigold looked up at the sound of the door, and her face brightened when she saw him. "Gideon," she said, surprise and pleasure mingling in her voice. "I did not expect to see you here." "I do not usually come to saloons," he admitted, suddenly feeling awkward. He was comfortable in the wilderness, confident in his ability to survive and thrive there, but social situations had never been his strength. "I wanted to see how you were doing." Her smile softened. "That is very thoughtful of you. I am doing well enough. Mr. Jameson is a fair employer, and the work keeps me busy." "Have they let you into the church yet?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Her smile faded. "No. I tried again 2 Sundays ago. Reverend Holbrook was even more adamant than before. He said that my association with you has only confirmed his suspicions about my character." Anger flared in Gideon's chest. "My association with you?" He said that a decent woman would not allow herself to be escorted by a mountain hermit who has rejected civilized society. She said it matter-of-factly, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. "It seems I cannot win, no matter what I do." Gideon's hands curled into fists at his sides. He wanted to march back to that church and have some very sharp words with the Reverend, but he knew that would only make things worse for Marigold. Instead, he took a breath and forced himself to calm down. "I am building something," he said, "up at my place in the mountains, something I think you will like. It will be finished by spring if the weather holds." She tilted her head, curiosity lighting her eyes. "What are you building?" "That's a surprise," he said, "but I hope you will come see it when it is done." "You are very mysterious, Gideon Kane," she said, but she was smiling again. "I would be honored to see whatever you are building." They talked for a while longer. and Gideon found himself relaxing in her presence. She had a way of listening that made him feel heard, really heard, in a way he had not experienced in years. She asked him about his life in the mountains, about the animals he encountered, about what it was like to live so far from other people. He asked her about St. Louis, about her parents, about the life she had left behind. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, and when he finally left to finish his errands, he felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he had not known he was carrying had been lifted. Winter came to the mountains with its usual ferocity. Snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the land in white silence. Gideon worked on the chapel whenever the weather allowed, and sometimes even when it did not. He built the foundation with stones he hauled up from the creek bed, fitting them together with care and precision. He raised the walls log by log, each one carefully notched and fitted. He built a steep roof to shed the snow, and he installed a chimney using river stone and mortar he mixed himself. The work was brutal in the cold, but he welcomed it. It gave him purpose, direction, and it gave him reason to think about Marigold, to imagine her face when she finally saw what he had built for her. He pictured her walking into the chapel, seeing the simple pews he was crafting, the altar he was building, the windows that would let in the mountain light. He imagined her kneeling to pray in peace, without judgment, without shame. He made 2 more trips to town that winter, both times seeking her out at the saloon. She was always glad to see him, and their conversations grew longer, more personal. She told him about her dreams of having a family someday, of finding a place where she belonged. He told her about his time in the war, about the things he had seen and done that made him seek the solitude of the mountains. She did not judge him, did not recoil from the darkness he had carried. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand, her touch gentle and warm. "We are all carrying something, Gideon," she said softly. "The mountains have helped you heal. Perhaps someday you will be ready to come back to the world." "Perhaps," he said, though he did not believe it. The world had nothing for him but painful memories and uncomfortable social obligations. But even as he thought it, he knew it was not entirely true anymore. The world had Marigold, and she was beginning to matter to him in ways he had not anticipated. By March, the chapel was nearly finished. He had installed the windows, simple but sturdy, that he had purchased from a supplier in Santa Fe. He had built 6 pews, enough for a small congregation, each one sanded smooth and polished with oil. He had constructed an altar from pine, simple and unadorned, but solid. He had even found an old Bible in an abandoned homestead down the valley, its pages yellowed but intact, and he placed it on the altar. The final touch was a bell. He had saved money for months, and in early April he rode all the way to Albuquerque to purchase one from a foundry there. It was small but clear-toned, and he hung it in a frame he built beside the chapel door. When he rang it for the first time, the sound echoed across the valley, pure and bright, and he felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. It was done. The chapel was finished. Now he just had to bring Marigold to see it. He rode into Roswell on a bright April morning, the air warm with the promise of spring. He had bathed in the creek, trimmed his beard, and put on his cleanest shirt, wanting to make a good impression. His heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the ride and everything to do with the woman he was about to see. He found her hanging laundry in the alley behind the saloon, her sleeves rolled up and her face flushed from the work. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her face broke into a radiant smile. "Gideon, I did not expect you until next week." "I finished the project I was telling you about," he said, dismounting. "I was hoping you would come see it." She set down the laundry basket, her eyes bright with interest. "Now? Today?" "If you can get away," he said. "It is a bit of a ride, but I promise it will be worth it." She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Let me tell Mr. Jameson. I'm sure he will not mind. Business is slow on Sunday mornings anyway." 10 minutes later, she emerged from the saloon wearing a simple green dress and a shawl, a small bag in her hand. Gideon helped her onto Buck, then swung up behind her. She tensed for a moment at the closeness, then relaxed against him, and he caught the faint scent of lavender in her hair. They rode north out of town, following the trail that led up into the mountains. Marigold gasped at the views as they climbed higher, the vast expanse of New Mexico spreading out below them in shades of brown and gold and green. "It is beautiful up here," she said, so peaceful. That is why I stay, Gideon said. Up here, the only voices you hear are the wind and the birds and your own thoughts. It is a good place to think. They reached his cabin an hour later. It was a sturdy structure built of logs with a wide porch and a roof that overhung to provide shade in summer and shelter in winter. Smoke curled from the chimney, for he had banked the fire before leaving. But he did not take her to the cabin. Instead, he guided Buck around to the clearing beyond, and there it stood, the chapel. It was small, perhaps 20 feet by 30, built of golden pine logs that glowed in the morning sun. The roof was steep and solid, and the windows gleamed like crystal. The door was simple but sturdy, and beside it hung the bell. It was humble, rustic even, but it was also beautiful in its simplicity, a testament to care and craftsmanship. Marigold slid down from the horse and stood staring at the chapel, her hand covering her mouth. "Gideon," she whispered, "what is this?" "It is a chapel," he said, dismounting beside her. "Your chapel, the one place in this territory where you are welcome to worship without judgment, without shame, where you can come whenever you want, for as long as you want, and no one will turn you away." She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "You built this? For me?" "For you," he confirmed. His heart was hammering now, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "You deserve a place to pray, Marigold. You deserve to be welcomed and valued. If those fools in town cannot see that, then I will make a place for you myself." She covered her face with her hands and sobbed, her shoulders shaking. Gideon stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure what to do, then gently pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, pressing her face against his chest and crying as if her heart would break. He held her, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soothing words he hoped made sense. "I am sorry," she said finally, pulling back and wiping her eyes. "I just cannot believe you did this. No one has ever done anything like this for me. No one has ever cared enough to try." "I care," he said simply. "I care very much." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why? You barely know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know that you are kind and brave and stronger than anyone gives you credit for. I know that you deserve better than what this world has given you. And I know that I want to help make that better possible." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his bearded cheek. "You are a good man, Gideon Kane. A truly good man." He caught her hand in his, holding it against his face. "Come see inside." He led her to the chapel door and pushed it open. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, but as their eyes adjusted, the simple beauty of the space revealed itself. The pews lined the center aisle, their wood gleaming with polish. The altar stood at the front, the Bible open upon it. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting patterns of light and shadow across the floor. It smelled of fresh wood and pine sap, clean and wholesome. Marigold walked slowly down the aisle, trailing her fingers along the pews. She reached the altar and picked up the Bible, opening it reverently. "This is perfect," she said softly. "Absolutely perfect." "You can come here any time," Gideon said from the doorway. "The ride is not too difficult once you know the way. Or if you prefer, I can bring you up whenever you want to come." She set the Bible down and turned to face him. "I do not know what to say. Thank you seems completely inadequate." "Thank you is enough," he said. "Your happiness is enough." She walked back to him, and when she reached him, she rose on her toes and kissed his cheek. It was a brief, chaste kiss, but it sent electricity racing through his entire body. "Thank you, Gideon. From the bottom of my heart, thank you." They spent the rest of the morning at the cabin. Gideon made them a simple lunch of bread and cheese and dried meat, and they sat on his porch talking and watching the clouds drift across the sky. Marigold seemed more relaxed than he had ever seen her, as if the weight she carried had finally been set down, at least for a little while. "Do you ever get lonely up here?" she asked at one point. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But loneliness in solitude is better than loneliness in a crowd. At least up here. I know what I'm dealing with." "I understand that," she said. "I'm lonely in town all the time, surrounded by people who despise me or ignore me or only see me as a servant. At least up here, I can be myself." "You can always be yourself here," Gideon said. "This can be a refuge for you if you want it to be." She smiled at him, and in that smile he saw something that made his heart skip. Affection. deep and genuine. I think I would like that very much. As the afternoon wore on, Gideon found himself reluctant to take her back to town. He wanted to keep her here, safe and happy, away from the judgment and cruelty that awaited her below. But he knew he could not keep her against her will, and she had responsibilities in Roswell. "I should get you back before dark," he said finally. "The trail can be tricky in low light." "I suppose you're right," she said, though she did not sound any more eager to leave than he was to see her go. They rode back down the mountain in comfortable silence, Marigold leaning back against him, his arms around her to hold the reins. It felt natural, right? As if they had been doing this for years rather than months. When they reached the edge of town, she reluctantly slid down from the horse. "Will you come visit the chapel again?" he asked. "As often as you will have me," she said. "Perhaps next Sunday?" "Next Sunday," he agreed. "I will come fetch you in the morning." She smiled, then reached up and squeezed his hand. "Thank you again, Gideon. This has been the best day I have had in a very long time." He watched her walk back toward the saloon, and only when she had disappeared from sight did he turn Buck toward home. His mind was full of her smile, her laugh, the way she had felt in his arms. He had built the chapel to give her a place to worship, but in doing so, he had given himself something as well, a reason to hope, to feel, to imagine a future that included more than just solitude and survival. Over the next several weeks, Gideon brought Marigold up to the chapel every Sunday. She would spend hours there, praying and reading and simply sitting in the quiet peace of the space. Sometimes Gideon would sit with her, not praying himself, but finding a strange comfort in the simple act of being present with her in that sacred space. Other times he would work on improvements to the cabin or tend to chores, but he was always nearby, always aware of her presence. They grew closer with each visit. Marigold began to open up more about her past, about the pain of losing her parents, about the loneliness and fear that had driven her west. Gideon, in turn, shared more of himself, telling her about his childhood in Tennessee, about the horrors of the war, about the nightmares that had plagued him for years afterward, and how the mountains had slowly healed those wounds. "You are healing me too," she said one Sunday afternoon as they sat on the porch of the chapel, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. "Just by being kind, by seeing me as a person rather than a scandal or a problem. You have given me back my dignity." "You never lost your dignity," Gideon said. "They tried to take it, but it was always yours." She turned to him, her eyes serious. "I think I am falling in love with you, Gideon Kane." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment Gideon could not breathe. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. "Marigold," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have been in love with you since the day I saw you on those church steps. I just did not know how to tell you." She smiled, radiant and joyful, and then she was in his arms, kissing him with a passion that matched his own. He held her close, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped around her waist, and he kissed her back with all the longing and love he had been holding inside for months. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, their faces flushed. "Marry me," he said. The words came out impulsively, but he did not regret them. "Marry me, Marigold. Stay here with me. Let me love you and protect you and build a life with you." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Gideon, I will marry you. I want nothing more than to be your wife." They kissed again, and this time it was slow and tender, a promise and a pledge. When they finally broke apart, the sun had set, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "We will need someone to marry us," Marigold said practically. "Reverend Holbrook certainly will not do it." "There is a circuit preacher who comes through these mountains," Gideon said. "Reverend Thomas. He's a good man, nothing like Holbrook. He should be through this area in another few weeks. We can ask him. In the meantime, I need to give notice to Mr. Jameson," Marigold said. "He has been kind to me, and I do not want to leave him in a difficult position." "Of course," Gideon agreed. "We will do this properly. But Marigold, I want you to know that from this moment forward, you are not alone. Whatever happens, we face it together." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the mountains settling in for the night. Gideon felt a peace he had not known in years, a sense that everything was finally falling into place, that his life was beginning again, in a way he had never imagined possible. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Marigold gave her notice to Mr. Jameson, who was sorry to lose her but wished her well. The other workers at the saloon, who had always been kind to her even when the rest of the town was not, threw her a small farewell party. Gideon came down from the mountain more frequently, helping Marigold pack her few belongings and make arrangements for the wedding. The townspeople were shocked when news of the engagement spread. Mrs. Patterson declared it a scandal, saying that a mountain hermit and a saloon girl deserved each other. Reverend Holbrook preached a sermon about the dangers of unequal yoking and the corruption that came from turning away from proper society. But there were others, too, who were quietly pleased. Samuel Parker, at the general store, shook Gideon's hand and said he was glad to see him happy. A few of the other women in town, those who had always felt the sting of Mrs. Patterson's judgment themselves, offered quiet congratulations to Marigold. Reverend Thomas arrived in mid-May, a kindly older man with silver hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Gideon met him on the trail and explained the situation, asking if he would perform the wedding ceremony. The Reverend listened carefully, then nodded. "I would be honored," he said. "Any man who builds a chapel for a woman he loves is a man after God's own heart. When would you like to be married?" "As soon as possible," Gideon said. "Tomorrow, if you are willing." Reverend Thomas laughed. "Tomorrow it is, then. Shall we hold the ceremony at the chapel you built?" "That would be perfect," Gideon said. The wedding took place on a sunny May morning. Marigold wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, and she had woven wildflowers into her hair. Gideon wore his best clothes, which admittedly were not much, but he had bathed and trimmed his beard and looked as respectable as a mountain man could look. Samuel Parker and his wife came up from town to serve as witnesses, along with two of Marigold's friends from the saloon. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. They stood before the altar in the chapel Gideon had built, and Reverend Thomas spoke about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. When it came time for the vows, Gideon's voice was strong and clear. "I promise to love you, to honor you, to protect you, and provide for you all the days of my life," he said, looking into Marigold's eyes. "You are my heart, my home, my reason for everything. I will never give you cause to regret this day." Marigold's voice trembled with emotion as she spoke her own vows. "I promise to love you, to stand by you, to be your partner and your comfort in all things. You have given me a home, a purpose, a place to belong. I will cherish you always." When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Gideon pulled Marigold into his arms and kissed her with all the love and passion in his heart. The small gathering applauded, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. They celebrated with a simple meal on the porch of the cabin, sharing food and stories and laughter. As the sun began to set, their guests departed, leaving Gideon and Marigold alone for the first time as husband and wife. Are you happy?" Gideon asked, pulling her close as they stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Marigold said. She turned in his arms and kissed him softly. "Take me inside, husband. I want to begin our life together properly." He swept her up in his arms, making her laugh, and carried her across the threshold into their home. The cabin was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in quilts, a stone fireplace, and furniture Gideon had built with his own hands. He set her down gently, then cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Marigold Kane," he said, "more than words can say." "Show me," she whispered, her eyes dark with desire and trust. He did, with tenderness and passion, worshiping her body as if it were sacred, learning every curve and hollow, every sound she made, every way he could bring her pleasure. She responded with equal passion, her hands exploring the hard muscles of his back and shoulders, her lips trailing fire across his skin. When they finally came together, it was with a sense of rightness, of two halves becoming whole, of a bond forged that could never be broken. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window, their bodies slick with sweat and trembling with the aftershocks of pleasure. Marigold traced patterns on Gideon's chest, her head resting on his shoulder. "I never knew it could be like that," she said softly. "So beautiful, so right." Neither did I, Gideon admitted. I have never felt this way about anyone. You have changed everything, Marigold. You have made me whole. She kissed his chest, then his jaw, then his lips. We have made each other whole. They made love again, slower this time, savoring every moment, every touch, every whispered word of love. And when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, they did so with the deep contentment of two souls who had finally found their home. Life on the mountain settled into a comfortable rhythm. Marigold took to her new life with enthusiasm and grace, learning the skills she needed to survive in the wilderness. Gideon taught her to shoot, to hunt, to identify edible plants and dangerous animals. She taught him to cook more than just basic trail food, to tend a garden, to appreciate small comforts, like embroidered pillows and curtains in the windows. They worked together to expand the cabin, adding a second room for storage, and a covered walkway to a small barn where they kept chickens and a milk cow. Marigold tended her garden with care, growing vegetables and herbs, and she dried flowers to brighten the cabin during the long winter months. Gideon hunted and trapped, providing meat and furs they could trade in town for the supplies they could not make themselves. And every Sunday, they went to the chapel together. Sometimes they prayed, sometimes they simply sat in silence, and sometimes they talked about their dreams for the future. It became their sanctuary, a place where they could reconnect with each other and with something greater than themselves. Word of their happiness slowly spread to Roswell. Samuel Parker brought news when Gideon came to town for supplies, telling him that opinion about the marriage was shifting. Some people still disapproved, but others had begun to reconsider their harsh judgment of Marigold. A few had even admitted that perhaps they had been too quick to condemn her. "Mrs. Patterson is still spreading poison," Samuel said with a shrug. "But fewer people are listening to her these days. People are starting to see that Marigold was never what they accused her of being." "I do not care what they think," Gideon said. "As long as they leave her alone, they can think whatever they want." "Fair enough," Samuel said. "But for what it is worth, I think you two are good for each other. Marriage suits you, Gideon. You look happier than I have ever seen you." Gideon could not deny it. He was happy, deeply and profoundly happy in a way he had never expected to be again. Marigold filled his life with light and laughter, with warmth and companionship. She made the cabin feel like a home rather than just a shelter. She made the mountains feel less lonely and more like a paradise. In the fall, Marigold began to feel unwell in the mornings. At first, she thought it was something she had eaten, but when the nausea continued for several weeks, Gideon insisted they ride down to see the doctor in Roswell. Dr. Hendricks, a gruff but competent man, examined Marigold and then smiled. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kane. You are going to have a baby." Marigold gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Gideon felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. A baby. They were going to have a baby. "Are you sure?" Marigold asked, her voice shaking. "As sure as I can be without waiting to see if I am right," Dr. Hendricks said. "I would estimate you are about 2 months along. The baby should arrive sometime in late April or early May." On the ride back up the mountain, they were both quiet, processing the news. When they reached the cabin, Gideon helped Marigold down from the horse and pulled her into his arms. "Are you happy?" he asked, suddenly uncertain. They had talked about children in an abstract way, but the reality was suddenly very immediate and very real. "I am terrified," Marigold admitted, "but yes, I'm happy. So happy, Gideon. We are going to have a baby, a family of our own." "I will take care of you," he promised. "Both of you. I will keep you safe, I swear it." "I know you will," she said, and her trust in him was absolute. The winter was long and harsh, with deep snows that sometimes kept them snowbound for days at a time. But Gideon had prepared well, and they had plenty of food and firewood. Marigold's belly grew round with their child, and Gideon found himself constantly amazed by the miracle of it, the idea that a new life was growing inside the woman he loved. He was also terrified. Childbirth was dangerous, especially this far from a doctor. He had seen women die in childbirth during the war, had heard the stories of babies lost and mothers who did not survive. The thought of losing Marigold filled him with a fear so intense it sometimes woke him from sleep, his heart pounding and his breath coming in gasps. Marigold, sensing his fear, would hold him and soothe him. "I am strong," she would tell him, "and you are here. We will be fine, Gideon. Trust in that." He tried to trust, but it was hard. He read everything he could find about childbirth, made lists of supplies they would need, even practiced delivering a calf when one of the neighbor's cows had trouble, wanting to be as prepared as possible. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts. By April, Marigold was huge and uncomfortable, her back aching and her ankles swollen, but she was also radiant, glowing with an inner light that made Gideon fall in love with her all over again every day. The baby came on a warm night in early May, when the apple trees Gideon had planted were just beginning to bloom. Marigold's labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Gideon stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring words of encouragement, even when he was sick with fear. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, with a final push and a cry that tore at Gideon's heart, the baby was born. Gideon caught the tiny, slippery body in his hands, marveling at the perfection of it, the miracle of new life. It was a boy, healthy and strong, with a lusty cry that filled the cabin. "A son," Gideon said, his voice thick with tears. "We have a son, Marigold." "Let me see him," she said weakly, reaching out her arms. Gideon wrapped the baby in a clean cloth and placed him in his mother's arms. Marigold looked down at the tiny face, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "He is perfect," she whispered, "absolutely perfect." "He looks like you," Gideon said, stroking the baby's downy head. "He has your jaw," Marigold said, "and your stubborn chin." They laughed together, exhausted and giddy with relief and joy. Gideon cleaned up the mess of the birth, tended to Marigold, made sure both mother and baby were comfortable and warm. Then he sat beside the bed looking down at his wife and son, and felt his heart expand until he thought it might burst. "What should we name him?" Marigold asked. They had discussed names during the long winter months but had not settled on anything. Now, looking at his son's tiny face, Gideon knew exactly what the boy's name should be. "Thomas," he said, "after the Reverend who married us, Thomas Kane." "Thomas," Marigold repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Thomas Gideon Kane." "Thomas Gideon Kane," Gideon agreed. He leaned down and kissed Marigold's forehead. "Thank you. Thank you for this gift, for our son, for everything." "Thank you for building me a chapel," she said with a tired smile. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else would. Thank you for loving me." "Always," he promised, "forever and always." Life with a baby was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he demanded constant attention. Marigold recovered from the birth slowly, and Gideon took on more of the household chores, learning to cook and clean while also tending to the animals in the garden. He did not mind. Every moment spent caring for his family was a moment of profound gratitude for the life they had built together. When Thomas was 3 months old, they took him to the chapel for a blessing. Reverend Thomas, on his circuit through the mountains again, performed a simple christening ceremony, dedicating the baby to God and praying for his health and happiness. Marigold cried through the entire service, and Gideon held her close, their son cradled between them. "You have been blessed, my friends," Reverend Thomas said afterward, "not just with this child, but with each other. Hold fast to that. Love is a rare and precious gift, and you have found it in each other." "We know," Gideon said, "and we will never take it for granted." As the years passed, their family grew. 2 years after Thomas was born, they welcomed a daughter, Grace, who had Marigold's dark hair and gentle nature. 3 years after that came another son, Samuel, named for their friend in Roswell, who was as wild and energetic as his older brother, was thoughtful and calm. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family. Gideon added rooms, built a larger barn, cleared more land for Marigold's expanding garden. The children grew up strong and healthy, learning to love the mountains as their parents did, learning to work hard and play harder. And through it all, the chapel remained their sanctuary. Every Sunday, the Kane family would walk the short distance from the cabin to the chapel, where they would sit together and pray and give thanks for the life they had been given. Sometimes other families from the surrounding area would join them, for word of the little chapel in the mountains had spread, and others who felt unwelcome in the town churches had found their way to this place of acceptance and peace. Gideon never charged anyone for the use of the chapel. It was open to all who came with sincere hearts, just as it had always been intended. Marigold would welcome visitors with warmth and grace, offering refreshment and conversation, and the chapel became known as a place of healing and restoration, just as the mountains had been for Gideon so many years before. The town of Roswell slowly changed too. Mrs. Patterson eventually moved away, and Reverend Holbrook was replaced by a younger, more compassionate minister who preached about love and acceptance rather than judgment and condemnation. Some of the women who had shunned Marigold years ago eventually apologized, admitting that they had been wrong to judge her so harshly. Marigold accepted their apologies with grace, though she never forgot the pain they had caused. But she did forgive, because that was who she was. She had learned through her own suffering to have compassion for others, to understand that people could change and grow. And she had learned from Gideon that love was stronger than hate, that kindness was more powerful than cruelty, that one person's actions could make a profound difference in the world. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Gideon took Marigold back to the chapel alone, leaving the children with Samuel Parker and his wife in town. It was a warm summer evening, and the mountains were alive with the sounds of birds and crickets and the distant rush of the creek. They sat together on the steps of the chapel, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. Gideon had his arm around Marigold, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, contentment radiating from her. "Do you remember the day I first brought you here?" Gideon asked. "I remember everything about that day," Marigold said. "I remember thinking that it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I could not believe you had built it for me. I remember realizing that I loved you, even though I barely knew you. I remember feeling for the first time in years that I might actually have a future worth living." "You gave me a future too," Gideon said. "Before I met you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You gave me purpose, gave me hope. You gave me a reason to be more than just a man hiding in the mountains." She turned to look at him, her eyes shining. "We saved each other." "Yes," he agreed, "we did." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. Then Marigold spoke again, her voice soft but serious. "I've been thinking about the chapel," she said, "about what it represents. It is more than just a building, Gideon. It is a symbol of love, of refusing to accept the world's judgment, of creating something beautiful out of pain. I think that is what our whole life together has been. We took the hurt and rejection and loneliness we both carried, and we transformed it into this beautiful life, this beautiful family." "That is the power of love," Gideon said. "It transforms everything it touches." "I want to make sure that transformation continues," Marigold said. "I want to make sure that the chapel remains a place of welcome and healing, not just for us, but for everyone who needs it. I have been thinking that we should establish it as an official church, with services every Sunday, open to anyone who wants to come. We could even bring in a circuit preacher to lead services when we cannot." Gideon considered this. He had never wanted the chapel to become a formal institution, had always envisioned it as a simple place of worship. But he understood what Marigold was saying. The chapel had become more than just their private sanctuary. It had become a beacon for others who were hurting, who were rejected, who needed a place to belong. "If that is what you want," he said slowly, "then that is what we will do. But it has to be done right. It has to remain a place of welcome, not judgment. No one gets turned away, no matter who they are or what they have done." "Exactly," Marigold said. "That is exactly what I want. A church that lives up to what church is supposed to be, a place of grace and love and redemption." They began making plans immediately. They approached Reverend Thomas about leading regular services, and he agreed enthusiastically, saying he had been hoping for something like this for years. They spread word throughout the mountain communities that the chapel was open to all every Sunday morning, and people began to come. At first it was just a handful, but gradually the congregation grew. There were farmers and trappers, miners and loggers, women who had been widowed or abandoned, men who carried scars from the war, families who had been turned away from other churches for being too poor or too different. They came to the little chapel in the mountains, and they found acceptance and peace. Gideon and Marigold worked tirelessly to support the growing congregation. They added benches to accommodate more people, organized meals after services so people could fellowship together, created a small library of books for people to borrow. The chapel became the heart of a community, a place where people could come not just to worship but to connect, to support each other, to build relationships. And through it all, the love between Gideon and Marigold deepened and grew. They were partners in every sense of the word, working together to build something beautiful and lasting. They still made time for each other, stealing quiet moments on the porch after the children were asleep, taking long walks through the mountains, making love with the passion and tenderness of newlyweds even after years of marriage. Their children grew up seeing this love, learning from it, understanding that marriage was meant to be a partnership of equals, that love was meant to be demonstrated through actions as much as words. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful young man who wanted to become a doctor so he could help people. Grace became a gifted musician, her voice soaring during the chapel services, bringing tears to eyes with her beauty. Samuel was wild and adventurous, always exploring, always pushing boundaries, but with a heart as big as the mountains themselves. When Gideon was 45 and Marigold was 42, they welcomed an unexpected fourth child, another daughter they named Hope. She was a miracle baby, born healthy and strong despite Marigold's age, and she brought a new sense of joy and wonder to the family. The older children doted on her, and Gideon spent hours rocking her to sleep, marveling all over again at the miracle of new life. "We are blessed," Marigold said one evening, as they sat together watching Hope sleep in her cradle. "More blessed than we deserve." "You deserve every blessing in the world," Gideon said. "You deserve more than I could ever give you." "You have given me everything," Marigold said. "A home, a family, a purpose, a place to belong. You saw me when I was invisible. You valued me when I was despised. You built me a chapel when I was turned away from the church. You gave me love when I thought I would spend my life alone. What more could anyone ask for?" Gideon pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I love you, Marigold Kane. More today than yesterday, and less than I will tomorrow." "I love you too," she said, "always and forever." The years continued to pass, bringing with them the joys and challenges of life. There were hard times, drought years when the crops failed and game was scarce, winters so harsh they wondered if they would survive. There was illness, including a terrible bout of pneumonia that nearly took Thomas when he was 15. There were losses too, as friends and neighbors aged and passed away, as the inevitable march of time took its toll. But through it all, Gideon and Marigold faced everything together, drawing strength from each other and from the love they had built. The chapel remained their anchor, the place they returned to again and again to reconnect with what mattered most: faith, family, love. When Gideon was 60, his hair gone silver and his body starting to show the wear of decades of hard mountain living, he and Marigold took a trip down to Roswell together. It had been years since either of them had spent significant time in town, preferring the peace and quiet of the mountains. But Samuel Parker had passed away, and they wanted to attend his funeral and pay their respects to a man who had been a true friend. The town had changed dramatically since the day Gideon had first seen Marigold turned away from the church. Roswell had grown, with new buildings and businesses, new families and new opportunities. The old church where Reverend Holbrook had preached was still there, but it had been renovated and expanded, and a young minister with progressive ideas now led the congregation. After the funeral, the minister approached Gideon and Marigold. "I have heard stories about you," he said, "about the chapel you built in the mountains, about the community you created there. I wanted to tell you that your example has inspired many people, including me. You showed what the church is supposed to be, a place of welcome and grace, not judgment and exclusion. Thank you for that." "We just did what needed to be done," Gideon said gruffly, uncomfortable with the praise. "That is what makes it so remarkable," the minister said. "You saw a need and you met it without waiting for permission or approval. That is the essence of Christian love." As they rode back up to the mountains that evening, Marigold was quiet, thoughtful. Finally, she spoke. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not intervened that day? If you had just walked on by when you saw me being turned away from the church?" "Never," Gideon said firmly, "because that was never an option. The moment I saw you, I knew I had to help. It was not even a choice. It was just what had to be done." "I wonder where I would be now," Marigold mused. probably still working at that saloon, still alone, still believing that I was somehow less than other people, that I did not deserve love or respect or a place to worship. You would have found your way eventually, Gideon said. You are too strong, too good, not to have found happiness somehow. Maybe, Marigold said, but I'm glad I found it with you. I'm glad you built me a chapel. I'm glad you loved me enough to see past what everyone else saw. I'm glad too, Gideon said, gladder than I can say. They rode in comfortable silence the rest of the way home, their bodies swaying in unison with the horse's gait, moving together as they had for decades now, in perfect harmony. The years brought more changes. Thomas completed his medical training and returned to the mountains to practice, setting up a clinic near the chapel where he could serve the mountain communities. Grace married a kind young man who shared her love of music, and they settled nearby, starting their own family. Samuel left to seek his fortune in Colorado, promising to write often and visit when he could. Hope grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's strength, and she took over much of the running of the chapel, organizing services and coordinating the community meals. Gideon's body continued to slow with age, his muscles not as strong as they once were, his movements not as quick. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Marigold never wavered. He still found joy in the simple things, watching the sun rise over the mountains, tending his garden, sitting with Marigold on the porch in the evenings, their hands intertwined. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, they renewed their vows in the chapel. It was a beautiful ceremony, presided over by Thomas, who had been ordained as a minister along with becoming a doctor. The chapel was packed with people whose lives had been touched by Gideon and Marigold's love and generosity over the years. 40 years ago, Gideon said, his voice still strong despite his age, I promised to love and honor this woman all the days of my life. It has been the easiest promise I ever kept. Marigold, you are my heart, my home, my reason for everything. I would build you 1,000 chapels if that was what it took to show you how much you mean to me. Marigold was crying openly, tears of joy streaming down her weathered face. 40 years ago, you gave me back my dignity, my faith, my belief that I was worthy of love. You built me a chapel where I was welcome, but more than that, you built me a life where I could thrive. You are the greatest blessing I have ever known, Gideon Kane, and I love you more now than I did on our wedding day. They kissed to thunderous applause, and then the celebration began. There was music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Children ran laughing through the clearing, and adults shared stories and memories. It was a perfect day, a celebration not just of one couple's love, but of the community that love had created. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Gideon and Marigold slipped away to the chapel. They sat together in their usual spot in the front pew, holding hands, watching the last light fade from the windows. Do you have any regrets? Marigold asked quietly. Not a single one, Gideon said. Everything I've done, every choice I've made led me to you. How could I regret any of it? I feel the same way, Marigold said. Even the hard times, even the pain, it all had a purpose. It all led to this moment, to this life we have built. They sat in peaceful silence for a while. Then Marigold spoke again. I want you to promise me something. Anything, Gideon said. Promise me that you will keep the chapel going after I am gone, she said, that you will make sure it remains a place of welcome and grace, just as we always intended. Do not talk like that, Gideon said, his voice rough with sudden emotion. You are not going anywhere. We are both getting old, my love, Marigold said gently. We have to face reality. One of us will leave first, and the other will have to carry on. I just want to know that if it is me, the chapel will continue. It will continue, Gideon promised. I swear it. But I hope I go first because I do not think I could bear this world without you in it. Whichever one of us is left will find the strength to carry on, Marigold said, because that is what we do. We endure, we love, we keep building, keep creating, keep making the world a better place. They stayed in the chapel until full dark had fallen, then walked hand in hand back to the cabin, their steps slower than they once were, but no less sure. They had walked this path together for 40 years, and they would walk it for as many more as God granted them. In the end, they were granted 5 more years, 5 more years of sunrises and sunsets, of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, of quiet moments on the porch and Sunday services in the chapel. 5 more years of love, deep and abiding and true. Gideon passed away peacefully in his sleep one cold December night, with Marigold beside him. He was 70 years old, and he died, as he had lived, on his own terms, in his own place, surrounded by love. Marigold held his hand as he took his last breath, and she kissed his forehead and whispered that she loved him, that she would see him again. She grieved deeply, but not destructively. She had always known this day would come, and she had prepared herself as much as anyone could. The children and grandchildren rallied around her, making sure she was never alone, making sure she knew she was loved and valued. She lived for 3 more years after Gideon's death, and she spent those years ensuring that everything they had built together would endure. She formalized the chapel as an official church, with bylaws and a governing board, guaranteeing that it would remain a place of welcome for generations to come. She wrote down the story of how the chapel came to be, so that future generations would understand the love and sacrifice that had gone into its creation. And every Sunday, she would sit in the front pew of the chapel, feeling Gideon's presence beside her, knowing that he was still with her in all the ways that mattered. When Marigold passed away peacefully in her sleep on a warm spring morning, exactly 48 years to the day after Gideon had first brought her to see the chapel, her family laid her to rest beside Gideon on a hill overlooking the valley. The chapel stood nearby, a testament to their love, and on the door was a plaque that Thomas had commissioned. This chapel was built by Gideon Kane for his beloved wife Marigold, that she might always have a place to worship in peace. May all who enter here find the same welcome, the same grace, the same love that they shared. All are welcome. None are turned away. And for generations to come, the chapel stood as a beacon of hope and healing, a reminder that one person's act of love could change lives, build communities, and create something beautiful that would endure long after they were gone. The mountain man, who had seen a woman being turned away from church and built her a chapel where she was welcome, had done more than build a structure of wood and stone. He had built a legacy of love that would never fade.